So much to the chagrin of Donald Trump, yesterday, Volodymyr Zelenskyy reiterated Ukraine's refusal to withdraw from the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine to reach a peace settlement with Vladimir Putin and Russia. So what is behind Ukraine's intransigence over sacrificing territory for peace, land for peace? And what does this all mean for the future trajectory of the Russo-Ukrainian war? So, Donbas, this is a region in the east of Ukraine. It consists of two oblasts, Donetsk and Luhansk. They have been under partial occupation since 2014 when Russia first invaded independent Ukraine, and Russia has expanded its control over those regions. They control almost all of Luhansk. I think there's just a tiny sliver of territory that is still under Ukrainian control, and they control a large amount of the territory of Donetsk Oblast. Now, what makes it interesting from a military point of view is you've probably seen there's a lot of fighting for at this stage, it's over a year and a half, I think, around the city, the small town really of Pokrovsk in the Donbas region in the Donetsk Oblast. There's two towns basically beside each other, Pokrovsk and Minorgrad. And it looks like Russia may finally seize control of that conurbation, maybe in the next week or so, although we kind of thought that almost a year ago, but let's see how they get on. After that, there are a series of strategically important bigger towns in Donetsk that Russia would need to conquer in order to reach full control of the Donbas region. Now, the estimates based on the current rate of Russian progression in advancing in the east of Ukraine are that it would take between 2 and 3 years for Russia to actually conquer that territory at the current rate of progress, and it would cost them hundreds and hundreds of thousands of casualties, so either soldiers that are killed in action or wounded in action. So it will come at a huge cost to Russia, and then clearly this would extend out their invasion just to take control of the Donbas region, never mind the other two oblasts that Vladimir Putin just decided to put in his constitution as being part of Russia, which are Kherson and Zaporizhia. So that means that it will come at a great sacrifice. Now, under the current Trump-backed peace plan for resolving the conflict, Ukraine would just retreat from those territories and apparently also have to recognize other occupied territories as being de jure Russia, which we'll get into that in a sec. Ukraine is just not going to do at the current point for sure. And basically there's an idea that it would be a demilitarized zone in this territory that Ukraine withdrew from, and there are other constraints in the Ukrainian military that have been proposed. There are no constraints on the Russian military. So what would be likely to happen militarily if Ukraine withdrew and there's no security guarantee for the Ukrainians that Russia wouldn't just invade again in the short to medium term? Well, you would see that the Russian military would have saved themselves about 2 to 3 years and hundreds of thousands of casualties. And now those highly fortified defensive towns that are protecting the rest of the Donbas from being occupied would suddenly be demilitarized, and basically Russia could just quickly advance and probably take those pretty quickly without so many casualties compared to having to fight for them now. And basically that would be the situation. So that would put the military balance on the ground in a very disadvantageous position for Ukraine. Of course, you could argue that Ukraine would get security guarantees. However, in the draft that we saw originally, the 28-point plan, it was phrased as security assurances, and that is the same language as the Budapest Memorandum back in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from the US and from Russia. And obviously, they mean absolutely nothing. In addition, in the last few days, we've had Trump's new national security strategy been published. I made a video about it a few days ago. And in that, it basically sets that the priority is for a quick resolution to the Russo-Ukrainian war. So basically, the US strategy is just suddenly to get a deal, not a deal that is likely to have longevity in it. And it is a document is particularly hostile to the European Union and is very favorable to Moscow. So And it also puts constraints on the future enlargement of NATO, so we can rule out any chance that Ukraine would join ever, or any other country apparently, including my home country Ireland, or say Moldova or somewhere else that might want to come in. So if that had been the case under the Biden administration, Finland and Sweden would not have been able to join NATO. So just think about the consequences of that. In short, it is with this national security strategy and the actions and rhetoric of the Trump administration since they came back into power in January in the White House, it suggests that, in fact, Article 5 itself may not be honored by the US if a NATO member were invaded, like, say, Estonia or Latvia or Finland or somewhere. So the chances of Ukraine getting any sort of security guarantee that would be credible from the US is close to zero. And even the European allies, are they even in a position to really defend the demilitarized zone in the Donbas, if that's what it was? And would they risk going to war directly with Russia? That seems very unlikely. So basically, we would have a situation, if Ukraine were to accept it, where they would be shortcutting the Russian advance by about 2 to 3 years and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Of course, Ukraine, in defending it, would also have a lot of casualties themselves, not to the same extent as Russia. Probably the Russian losses would be at least three times as high, judging on what has happened up until now in the region, at least 3 times as high. But that also would obviously be a negative impact, have a negative impact on Ukraine. However, just conceding it would help the Russian military if they were to decide just to restart hostilities within, they could do it within weeks basically of agreeing to this and seeing it implemented. So that is why it makes very little military sense for the Ukrainians. Now, politically, the giving up territory, just handing it over, reminds most historians of what happened in the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia at the time, back in 1938, they had heavily well-defended positions in the Sudetenland facing Nazi Germany, and basically the Czechs were persuaded to allow Germany to take control of the Sudetenland. It was a majority German-speaking region in the west of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for promises that, the Germans wouldn't go any further. And of course, they ignored that extremely quickly afterwards and just took over all of Czechoslovakia. And they found themselves in a position after they'd given up the Sudetenland that they didn't really have any way to defend themselves from further German encroachment. So that is a lesson. So politically, just the idea of giving up these fortified positions is a non-starter at the moment in Ukraine, not just for President Zelenskyy, but also it doesn't have support amongst the general populace, amongst the elite, and definitely not amongst the military. So it doesn't look like that would be palatable. Just the idea of even recognizing territory that is legally Ukraine, so Crimea, the occupied parts of Ukraine in the other regions, and saying that they are de jure Russian, doesn't look like it has any meaningful political support in Ukraine now. Recognizing de facto control and that the Russians currently occupy these territories, and that maybe the fighting stops in the short run, may be something that Ukraine is willing to accept in exchange for other things that could be given as a quid pro quo. And then you could look at, say, Azerbaijan and Armenia as an example, where Azerbaijan was able to reclaim territories that Armenian-backed separatists were controlling in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and actually some region between Armenia proper and Nagorno-Karabakh. And we saw in the last few years that Azerbaijan was able to build up its military and eventually reclaim those territories relatively quickly and without a huge amount of fighting, but they had to wait a few decades. Now that is something that Ukraine may be willing to accept as a compromise. However, just giving up the Donbas region and saving Russia all this time in exchange for nothing really meaningful in the eyes of Ukrainians other than the fighting stopping, almost certainly just very temporarily, makes it a non-starter. Looking at this, zooming out, we have the national security strategy that the Trump administration has published, and it is extremely disconcerting for the US's, well, I would say the White House's relationship with the European Union and with Ukraine. However, the US is not a dictatorship. The power is not controlled completely by the president. He is not obviously a dictator, and there is separation of power. So actually Congress has a lot of influence. So even though this is the current White House's strategy, there are a lot of restraints on that, seeing as how much Donald Trump could actually do in order to achieve those strategic aims that he's outlined. And we are going to see midterm elections in the US this time next year, and in the lead up to them, there will probably almost certainly be a sea change in attitude, definitely amongst the Congress and people running for Congress. If you look at the opinion polls, then you see that I saw one opinion poll that had around 10 big issues, and Donald Trump's approval rating was the lowest for his handling of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And also you see that it is extremely unpopular with independents. I mean, obviously the Democrats are against most things that Donald Trump does, so we can kind of exclude that. However, the fact that independents, he had an approval rating for his Ukraine policy of around 15%. It's so low, and that indicates that this is a big losing issue for the Republicans going into those midterm elections. And there are many Republican politicians in the House of Representatives and in the Senate who are not in favor of this policy. Also, just amongst Republicans in general, sending more support for Ukraine has majority support amongst Republican voters. So it is really a minority opinion, this strategy within the Republican Party, and that indicates that it will be hard for Donald Trump to actually execute on this strategy, especially by this time next year. So I think the Ukrainians probably can calculate that their position politically vis-a-vis the US and these attempts to get a deal are likely to have a certain lifespan, probably not much more than, say, the late spring, and they could be in a better position with respect to potential future negotiations with Russia if they hold out now and don't agree to what would effectively be a it could even be a short-term capitulation plan, but really a midterm to long-term capitulation plan, which is what the US is basically proposing to them at the moment, and not even including the Europeans in the whole process. Anyways, that is what I will say today about Donbas, but it has become the main it's described as the main sticking point. I mean, it's one of the principal things, who gets to control the territory, and I don't see any sort of situation for now in which a Ukrainian leader, even if there were a new leader in Ukraine who would be willing to give up territory that is currently controlled by Ukraine in the Donbas, especially this very strategic territory, never mind recognize it as any of it as de jure Russian. Drop your comments down below where you think this is all going. And it should also be reminded that this is an alternative for Vladimir Putin to actually take control of the Donbas region, which he has failed to do militarily in over 11 years at this point. This war started in 2014. He was able to successfully take control of Crimea. However, they failed in their attempts to take control of all of Donbas. Never mind the other regions. Back in 2014, we had also instances here in Odessa. And it's interesting to see that the great white hope that he had of Trump getting elected has given him an alternative strategy to try and seize control of that territory diplomatically as opposed to militarily. However, as I just said in the video, it doesn't look like Ukraine is going to acquiesce with those demands. Anyways, drop your comments down below, and I will see you tomorrow in a new video. From here in Odessa, Mama, Slava Ukraini, as written on my t-shirt, Herom Slava.